What if everything you were taught was only half the truth? What if the very name you've been using your entire life wasn't real to begin with? They told you, this land is called Africa, but they never told you who named it, why it was named, or what was erased in the process. This isn't just history. This is identity rewritten. Because long before that name existed, this land had thousands of voices, thousands of names, and stories powerful enough to shake everything you think you know. So before you skip this video, ask yourself one question. What if the truth was hidden in plain sight? We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Don't skip it. They told you it was called Africa. They printed it on maps, etched it into textbooks, whispered it into classrooms, and repeated it so often that it began to feel like truth. But history, real history, is rarely that simple. And sometimes what we accept as truth is nothing more than a story told long enough to silence all others. Because this land, this vast, breathing, ancient land was never just Africa. Long before borders were drawn by foreign hands, before languages were replaced, before names were rewritten, this land carried thousands of names, names spoken in rhythm with drums, in harmony with rivers, in reverence to ancestors, names that meant something. To the people of the north, it was Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich, dark soil that gave life to one of the world's earliest civilizations. Not a void on a map, but a cradle of knowledge, architecture, and philosophy. Further south and across the great expanse, there was no single name, because there was no single identity. This was no single identity. This was many worlds woven together. The Akan people spoke of their lands with pride, tied to lineage and spirit. The Zulu called their home KwaZulu, the place of heaven. The Ethiopians knew their land as Abyssinia, a name rooted in centuries of sovereignty and resilience. Across the Sahel, empires like Mali and Songhai rose, not as footnotes, but as centers of wealth, scholarship, and power. There was no Africa in the way we understand it today. So where did the name come from? Some say it traces back to the Romans, who referred to a region near modern-day Tunisia as Africa Terra, possibly derived from the name of a local tribe, the Afri. Others argue it comes from a Greek word meaning without cold, or from a Phoenician term meaning dust. But here's what matters. It was not a name chosen by the people of the land. It was given, and names carry power. To name something is to define it. To define it is to shape how it is seen, how it is remembered, and perhaps most importantly, how it is controlled. When European powers arrived, they did not just take land. They took language. They redrew boundaries, erased identities, and replaced thousands of voices with one convenient label, Africa, a continent reduced to a single word. But imagine for a moment what was lost in that simplification. The sound of a mother calling her child in a language older than empire. The identity of a people tied not to a continent, but to a river, a mountain, a story. The pride of belonging not to a place defined by outsiders, but to one understood from within. This was not just geography, it was humanity. And yet, over time, the world began to see this vast land through a narrow lens. One name, one narrative, often one story of struggle, stripped of its complexity, its brilliance, its truth. But history has a way of resurfacing. It whispers through ruins, speaks through oral traditions, and lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Because the truth is, this land has always been more than a name. It is a mosaic of civilizations, a tapestry of cultures, a testament to human endurance and creativity. It is the birthplace of humankind, where the earliest footsteps of our species were pressed into the earth. It is a place where knowledge was built, traded, and preserved long before many parts of the world had even begun to write their stories. And so, when we say Africa, we must understand what we are really saying. We are speaking a name layered over thousands of others, a name that tells only part of the story, a name that tells only part of the story, a name that, while widely accepted today, does not erase what came before. This is not a call to reject the name entirely. It is a call to remember that behind every label lies a deeper truth. That history is not owned by those who wrote it down last, but by those who lived it first. That identity is not something given, it is something carried, protected, and passed on. They told you it was called Africa. But now you know that was never the whole truth. And perhaps the real question is not what this land is called, but whether we are finally ready to hear what it has been saying all along. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. They told you the name was always there, as if it rose naturally from the soil, as if it belonged to the land in the same way the rivers belong to their valleys. Africa, they said, with certainty, with authority, with the quiet confidence of something that no longer feels questioned. It appears on every modern map, spoken in every classroom, printed in every classroom, printed in every history book. It feels ancient, permanent, unquestionable, but the truth is far more complicated and far more human. The word itself does not come from the voices of the countless peoples who have lived across this vast land for millennia. It was not shaped in the markets of Timbuktu, nor spoken in the royal courts of Great Zimbabwe, nor carried through the oral traditions of the Yoruba, the Berbers, or the countless other cultures whose histories stretch back thousands of years. Instead, the name Africa emerged from the outside, from those who arrived, observed, and named according to their own understanding, their own language, and their own language, and their own needs. One of the most widely accepted origins traces back to the Romans, who used the term Africa Terra to describe the land around Carthage in what is now modern-day Tunisia. The word may have been derived from the name of a local tribe, the Afri, though even that connection remains uncertain, debated by historians who continue to piece together fragments of the past. To the Romans, it was simply a way to describe a region they encountered, a label that helped them organize their expanding world. It was never intended to define an entire continent filled with immense diversity, but over time the name expanded, stretching far beyond its original meaning. Other theories suggest Greek or Phoenician roots, pointing to words that meant without cold or dust, descriptions shaped not by identity but by observation, by how the land appeared to those who stood at its edges. These interpretations reveal something important. The name was descriptive, external, and limited. It did not emerge from within the cultures it came to represent. It did not carry the spiritual, historical, or emotional weight that local names often hold. It was, in many ways, a simplification. And yet, as centuries passed, that simplification hardened into something more permanent. As European exploration intensified and colonial ambitions grew, the need to categorize, map, and control became central to how the land was understood. Maps were drawn not just to reflect reality, but to shape it. Borders were carved with little regard for the complex networks of identity that already existed. Languages were imposed, systems restructured, and names standardized. Africa became a convenient umbrella, a single term that could encompass an entire continent, in the minds of those who governed from afar, but convenience often comes at a cost. Because before the name Africa was widely used, this land was not seen as a single unified entity. It was a vast mosaic of kingdoms, empires, societies, and cultures, each with its own sense of identity, its own history, its own name. The people who lived along the Nile did not share a singular label with those in the forests of Central Africa or the plains of the South. Their worlds were distinct, connected at times through trade and migration, but never reduced to a single identity. Names, in these contexts, were not arbitrary. They were deeply meaningful. They reflected relationships to the land, to ancestry, to belief systems, and to history. A name could tell you where someone came from, who their people were, what they valued, and how they understood their place in the world. To replace those names with a single external label was not just an act of simplification. It was an act that reshaped perception. Over time, the repetition of the word Africa began to erase the memory of its origins. Generations grew up hearing it as the only name, rarely questioning where it came from or what existed before it. It became normalized, embedded so deeply in global language that its foreign roots were almost entirely forgotten. What was once an external designation became internalized, accepted even by those whose ancestors had never used it. This is how power often works, not through force alone, but through language, through the quiet persistence of ideas that are repeated until they feel inevitable. When a name is imposed from the outside, it carries with it the perspective of those who created it. It shapes how the world sees a place, and sometimes how that place comes to see itself. In the case of Africa, the name became associated not just with geography, but with narratives constructed over centuries, narratives that often overlooked the richness, complexity, and diversity of the continent's many cultures. It is important to understand that the use of the name today is not inherently wrong. Language evolves, and meanings shift over time. Language evolves, and meanings shift over time. Many people across the continent now identify with the term, using it as a symbol of unity, resilience, and shared history in the face of external pressures. But acknowledging its origins allows for a deeper understanding of how that identity was shaped and what may have been lost in the process. Because beneath the name Africa lies a far older story, one that cannot be contained within a single word. It is a story of countless peoples, each with their own voice, their own history, their own way of naming the world around them. It is a story that existed long before the Romans wrote their maps, long before European powers redrew borders, long before the modern concept of a continent took shape. The imposed name did not erase those histories, but it did obscure them. Placing a single label over a vast and intricate tapestry. To look beyond that label is to begin to see the depth that lies underneath, to recognize that what we call something is not always what it has always been. And in that recognition, there is a quiet but powerful shift from accepting a name as absolute truth to understanding it as part of a much larger, more complex human story. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The idea of a single unified identity for this vast land is a relatively recent construction, shaped more by external perspectives than by the lived realities of the people who have called it home for thousands of years. Long before the term Africa came to dominate maps and language, the land existed as a constellation of worlds, each with its own rhythm, its own memory, its own name, its own name. To understand this is to step into a past where identity was not flattened into a single word, but expressed through an extraordinary diversity of cultures, languages, and histories. Across the northern regions, along the life-giving flow of the Nile, the civilization known as Kemet flourished. The name itself, meaning the Black Land, reflected a deep connection to the fertile soil that sustained one of the most advanced societies of the ancient world. This was not just a place, it was a worldview, a system of knowledge that encompassed science, architecture, spirituality, and governance. The people who lived there did not see themselves as part of a larger entity called Africa. Their identity was rooted in their land, their traditions, and their understanding of the cosmos. Further west, the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai rose and fell, each leaving behind legacies of wealth, scholarship, and influence that reached far beyond their borders. In cities like Timbuktu, scholars gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature, preserving knowledge in manuscripts that still endure today. His empires were connected through trade routes that stretched across the Sahara, linking them to North Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Europe, Yet despite these connections, their identities remained distinct, shaped by their own languages, their own systems of governance, and their own cultural practices. In the forests and along the coasts of West Africa, societies such as the Yoruba, the Akan, and the Igbo developed rich traditions that were deeply intertwined with spirituality, art, and community life. Their names for their lands were not arbitrary. They carried meaning tied to ancestry, belief, and belonging. These were not interchangeable identities, nor were they fragments of a larger whole waiting to be unified under a single label. They were complete in themselves, each representing a unique way of understanding the world. Moving eastward, the highlands of Ethiopia gave rise to a civilization that maintained its independence and cultural continuity for centuries. Known historically as Abyssinia, this region developed its own written language, its own religious traditions, and its own sense of identity that was both deeply rooted and outward-looking. The people here did not define themselves in relation to a continent, but through their history, their faith, and their enduring sovereignty. In the southern regions, kingdoms such as Great Zimbabwe stood as powerful centers of trade and architecture, their stone structures bearing witness to a sophisticated society that engaged in commerce with distant lands. The name Zimbabwe itself, derived from a Shona phrase meaning houses of stone, speaks to a cultural identity grounded in place and achievement. It is a reminder that names were often reflections of lived experience, not imposed abstractions. Among the Zulu people, identity was closely tied to lineage, language, and land. The term KwaZulu, meaning place of the Zulu, conveyed a sense of belonging that was both specific and deeply personal. It was not a generic label, but a declaration of identity that connected individuals to their ancestors and to each other. Similar patterns existed across the continent, where names defined not just geography, but relationships between people, between communities, and between generations. What emerges from this vast tapestry is not a single story, but thousands of stories, each with its own voice. The land was not experienced as one place, but as many, each with its own boundaries, its own centers of power, its own systems of meaning. These identities were dynamic, evolving over time through migration, trade, conflict, and cooperation. They were not static, but they were always grounded in local realities. The imposition of a single name, therefore, did more than simplify geography. It reshaped how the world perceived this diversity by grouping countless distinct societies under one label. It created the illusion of uniformity where none had existed. It encouraged narratives that overlooked the complexity of individual cultures, reducing them to parts of a generalized whole. This was not merely a linguistic shift, but a conceptual one, influencing how history was written, how knowledge was organized, and how identities were understood. It is important to recognize that the people of this land were never without identity, never waiting to be named or defined by outsiders. Their names existed long before external labels were introduced, and those names carried meanings that cannot be fully translated or replaced. They spoke of origins, of journeys, of relationships that extended beyond the physical landscape into the spiritual and the ancestral. Even today, these identities persist, woven into languages, traditions, and cultural practices that continue to thrive. Despite centuries of external influence, they are present in the stories passed down through generations, in the ceremonies that mark life's transitions, in the art and music that express both continuity and change. The use of a single continental name has not erased these identities, but it has often overshadowed them, making it easier for the world to overlook the depth and diversity that define this land. To look beyond the idea of a singular identity is to begin to see the richness that has always been there. It is to understand that what is often presented as one place is, in reality, a vast and intricate mosaic composed of countless pieces that cannot be reduced to a single narrative. Each name, each culture, each history adds to this mosaic, creating a picture that is far more complex and far more human than any single word could ever capture. To name something is never a neutral act. It is an assertion, a quiet declaration of perspective that carries with it the weight of power. A name does more than identify. It frames, it defines, it shapes the way something is seen not only by others, but eventually by those who live within it. When a name is repeated often enough, it begins to feel inevitable, as if it could never have been otherwise, if it could never have been otherwise. And yet, behind every widely accepted name lies a moment when it was first spoken, first written, first imposed or embraced, carrying with it a particular way of understanding the world. When external forces assign a name to a place, they are not simply labeling geography. They are translating that place into their own language, their own worldview, their own system of meaning. In doing so, they inevitably simplify what they encounter, because no single word, especially one created from the outside, can fully capture the complexity of a land shaped by thousands of histories, cultures, and identities. The act of naming becomes a kind of compression, reducing something vast and intricate into something more manageable, more familiar to those who hold the authority to define it. Over time, this simplification begins to influence perception. A single name encourages a single story, or at least the illusion of one. It invites the world to think of a place not as a collection of distinct experiences, but as a unified whole. In the case of a land as diverse as the one we now call Africa, this has profound consequences. It can obscure the differences between cultures, languages, and histories, blending them into a generalized image that rarely reflects reality. It becomes easier to speak about the land in broad strokes, to assign characteristics that do not apply universally, to overlook the individuality that exists within it. This is not simply an academic concern. Perception shapes action. The way a place is named and understood influences how it is treated, how its history is written, and how its people are seen. and how its people are seen. When a name carries with it simplified or incomplete associations, those associations can become deeply ingrained, affecting everything from education to policy to cultural representation. The narrative that grows around a name can either illuminate complexity or conceal it, depending on how that name is used and understood. The process is often gradual, almost imperceptible. A name appears on a map, then in a book, then in everyday speech. It is taught to children, repeated by scholars, reinforced by media. With each repetition, it becomes more entrenched, more difficult to question. Eventually, it reaches a point where it feels natural, where its origins are no longer considered, where it is accepted not as one possible way of describing a place, but as the only way. At that point, the name has done more than label. It has reshaped understanding. What makes this particularly powerful is that names do not exist in isolation. They are part of larger systems of language and knowledge and that determine how we categorize the world. When a single name becomes dominant, it often brings with it a framework for thinking that aligns with the perspective of those who introduced it. This framework can influence how history is organized, which stories are emphasized, and which are marginalized. It can create hierarchies of importance, where certain narratives are elevated while others are pushed to the margins. In many cases, local names and identities do not disappear entirely, but they become less visible in global discourse. They may continue to exist within communities, preserved through language, tradition, and memory, but they are often overshadowed by the dominant label. This creates a disconnect between how a place is understood internally and how it is perceived externally. The richness of local identity remains, but it is filtered through a broader narrative that may not fully capture its depth. At the same time, it is important to recognize that names can evolve in meaning. A name that was once imposed can, over time, be reinterpreted, reclaimed and infused with new significance by those who use it. This process reflects the dynamic nature of identity itself, which is never fixed, but constantly shaped by history, experience, and collective understanding. The name Africa, for many, has come to represent not just a geographical space, but a sense of shared history and solidarity, particularly in response to external challenges and historical injustices. Yet even as meanings evolve, the origins of a name remain significant. They remind us that what we often take for granted is the result of specific historical processes, shaped by power, perspective, and circumstance. Understanding those origins does not require rejecting the name as it is used today, but it does invite a deeper awareness of what lies beneath it. It encourages us to question the assumptions that come with it, to look beyond the surface and recognize the layers of history and identity that it encompasses. This awareness opens the door to a more nuanced way of seeing the world. Instead of accepting names as complete representations, we can begin to see them as entry points into deeper stories. We can ask what has been included, what has been left out, and why. We can listen for the voices that may not be immediately visible, the histories that exist beyond the dominant narrative. In doing so, we move closer to an understanding that is not limited by a single perspective, but enriched by many. Because in the end, a name is never just a word. It is a lens, a way of seeing that shapes everything that comes after. And when that lens is too narrow, it does not just simplify, it distorts, leaving behind a version of reality that is easier to grasp, but far less true if you found stillness in these words. Subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Thank you for listening. And don't forget to like and subscribe.